This is a video. You can watch this if you want. This is it's about that challenge of like, how do you write questions, because you might not always be aware that you're phrasing your questions in a leading way or something like that. So you have to, when you design a survey, you have to do a bunch of test runs. You have to get a lot of feedback from people before you actually do the survey that counts. Okay. The third research method I'm going to talk about is experiments. These are used in the natural science as well as in the social sciences. So there are similar research designs where you have an experimental group and a control group, where it's much easier to talk about experiments in the context of the natural sciences. So just to, if you don't know the difference between experimental and control groups. So let's say you're interested in, you're like a medical researcher, and you're interested in determining if there's a causal relationship between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. So what you do is you study two groups of people, where one group smokes cigarettes. That's the experimental group. They are getting the experimental treatment, which is cigarettes and nicotine. And then the control group is supposed to be essentially identical to the experimental group in all ways, except for the control group doesn't get the cigarettes. So if you find a difference in lung cancer rates between the two groups, you can more plausibly claim that it was the cigarettes that caused the lung cancer, because there aren't other variables playing a role for the one group that aren't playing a role for the other group. So social science research has a similar kind of design. It's just not often as straightforward or as easy to explain as experiments in the natural sciences. So, all right, in terms of the strengths of experiments, experiments are good because a researcher can control the influence of specific variables. So if you use the cigarette example I just talked about, the researcher can really control that. Okay, this one group is getting cigarettes and the control group is not getting cigarettes. They can. I'm using the word to control too often. Also, one advantage of experiments is that they're easier to replicate. Remember, I talked about that in the context of reliability. Experiments are easier to replicate than, say, an ethnographic study. If someone wanted to replicate Alice Goffman's study, they'd have to, go live in this neighborhood, gain everybody's trust, and then it would just be a very difficult process. Whereas with an experiment, it's generally fairly, it doesn't require all that kind of trust establishment at the beginning. So you can just do the experiment the same way that someone else did it and see if you get the same results. One of the criticisms of experiments, particularly in the social sciences, is that if as sociologists we're trying to study society and social life, some people make the claim that a laboratory is so unlike the real world that can you really recreate real life in a laboratory? Some people say yes, some people say no. There's also this issue of something called the Hawthorne effect. This is kind of an interesting phenomenon that I'll talk a little bit more about on the next slide. But what this refers to is that people sometimes behave differently when they know they're being studied. So, if they do behave differently because they're being studied, that's something called the Hawthorne effect, and that can really throw off your experimental results. So, let me go into a little bit more depth about that and talk some about the Hawthorne effect. You can there's a lot more detail. It's discussed on page 36 of the online textbook if you want a sort of briefer discussion. This link will take you to a more in-depth discussion of what happened, but I will give you the kind of summary here on the PowerPoint. So back in the almost 100 years ago, there was a lot of interest in trying to increase worker efficiency in factories around the world, including in the United States. So one variable that people were interested in, well, in this case you have worker productivity. That's the dependent variable. How much do workers produce in a day? An independent variable that some people thought might cause changes in worker productivity was lighting conditions in a factory, like brighter light, dimmer light. How does that affect productivity? How do changes in lighting conditions affect worker productivity? So they had this idea to do a study at a factory in Illinois. I think it was in a town called Hawthorne. That's where the name comes from. And they thought it would be a fairly straightforward experiment where you just have a control group where you don't change the lighting conditions, and then maybe you have an experimental group that works in brighter conditions, and then another group working in dimmer conditions compared to the control group. And then you just see, you measure the productivity and you're done. It seemed like it could be done certainly in less than a year, but as you can see on this slide, it took 5 years to do this study because no one could figure out. The results just didn't seem to fit any pattern. Specifically, any changes in the lighting conditions for the experimental group resulted in increased productivity, no matter what the change was. If it got brighter, the productivity went up. If it got dimmer, productivity went up. And this was just really confusing to the people doing the study. So eventually, what they figured out was that the workers were increasing their productivity. They were working harder because they knew that their productivity was being measured. So they were kind of getting nervous, being like, "Oh man, they're measuring my productivity. I just got to work harder. I don't want to lose my job." So that became known as the Hawthorne effect. When people know that they're being studied, this can cause them to behave differently than they would behave normally under normal conditions. And, we want to, as social scientists, we want to study how people are going to behave, under, we don't want to know how people behave when they're being studied. We want to know how they behave, in real life, for lack of a better phrase. The thing about, here's the, well, actually, let me just, this is the lesson that I was going to talk about.